grew up in Cold Creek, Montana, a town where winters lasted too long and memories lasted even longer. The kind of place where outsiders weren't welcome. My family was the only black family for miles, and from the day we moved in, we were a whisper in grocery aisles, a side eye at Sunday service, a name no one wanted to remember. But my father never let it break him. He carried himself like he belonged, even when everyone around him insisted otherwise. He worked as a mechanic, fixing trucks for men who would never shake his hand, repairing engines for people who never looked him in the eye. And every Sunday, he sat in the same pew at church, nodding politely to the congregation that refused to nod back. He used to tell me, "You don't have to be welcome to exist, but there's only so long you can ignore a town that doesn't want you." The first time I saw real hate was when I was 8 years old. It was late October and the first snowfall had just dusted the streets. My father was outside stacking firewood when we heard the truck. It rolled slow past our house, headlights dimmed, leaving a trail of deep tire marks in the fresh snow. My mother pulled me away from the window, but I could still hear the sound, a thud, a dull, wet sound. When my father came back inside, there was blood on his hands. He wasn't hurt, but our dog was. Rusty, our old golden retriever, had been nailed to the barn door, his fur matted with red, his eyes open but empty. Someone had left a note pinned to his collar. "Go back where you came from." I don't remember much after that. I just remember my mother crying, my father burying Rusty in the frozen ground, and the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. We never found out who did it, but we didn't need to. Cold Creek made sure we knew we weren't welcome. I spent my whole childhood waiting to leave, waiting for the day I could step onto a bus and never look back. That day came when I turned 18. I packed my bags, hugged my mother, shook my father's hand, and promised to send letters. "I'm proud of you," he said, gripping my shoulder, "but don't let them change who you are." I thought I knew what he meant, but I didn't. Not yet. I moved to Chicago, where no one cared about my name or my past. I worked hard, studied harder, built a life far from the cold, empty streets of my childhood, and for a long time, I convinced myself that I had escaped it. Until the day I got the phone call. My mother's voice was strained, the kind of quiet panic she only had when she was trying to keep it together. "It's your father," she said. They found him. I took the first flight back. The whole way home, my mind ran in circles. I pictured my father in a hospital bed, maybe bruised, maybe weak, but alive. I should have known better. Cold Creek never let a black man leave on his own terms. They found him in the woods 3 miles from our house, frozen, face down in the snow. The sheriff said it was an accident, that he must have been out hunting, gotten lost, that the storm took him before he could find his way back. But my father didn't hunt, and the storm hadn't started until hours after he was already dead. They ruled it an accident, buried him, and that was supposed to be the end of it. But I couldn't let it go, because when I looked at the death report, something didn't sit right. My father's boots were clean, too clean, as if he had been placed there. I started asking questions. I knocked on doors that were slammed in my face. I walked into the sheriff's office and demanded answers. And that's when the phone calls started. Late at night, no one on the other end. Then the letters, no return address. Let it go, but I didn't let it go, because my father had spent his whole life refusing to back down. And if I didn't fight for him, who would? I started digging. I found an old man, Mr. Calloway, who had lived in Cold Creek his entire life. He used to come to my father's shop sometimes, one of the few people in town who didn't seem to mind us being there. When I asked him about my father's death, his face turned pale. "I don't know anything," he said. I stared at him. "I think you do." He shook his head, eyes darting toward the window. "You need to leave, son." I didn't move. "So," he sighed, and then he told me, the night before my father died, he had gotten into an argument with a group of men at the bar. White men. Men with old names. Names that carried weight in Cold Creek. They didn't like how my father walked through town like he belonged there. Didn't like how he wouldn't bow his head. So they followed him home, took him from his truck, and left him in the woods to freeze. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear the whole town apart, but I already knew how this would end. Cold Creek didn't punish its own. I went to the sheriff, showed him what I found. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "This ain't your home no more. Best if you leave it alone." I left Cold Creek that night. I never went back. My mother moved in with me a year later. We never spoke about my father's death again. But some nights, I dream about him. I see him walking through the snow, footprints vanishing behind him. I call out, but he doesn't turn, because he's not lost. He knows exactly where he is. And that town that tried to erase him, it will never forget his name.